One of the most controversial acronyms in America right now is DEI. If you've spent any time watching cable news, scrolling social media, or listening to political speeches over the last few years, you've probably noticed that those three letters can trigger an almost immediate reaction. For some people, DEI represents fairness, opportunity, and social progress. For others, including the current regime, it represents discrimination, lowered standards, and institutional favoritism. It's become one of those topics where everyone seems to have strong opinions, but relatively few people stop to make sure they're arguing about the same thing. And that's a problem, because DEI tends to generate more heat than light. Welcome to another bonus edition of the MTB Podcast, a segment of the weekly episode that I call Afterthoughts. This is my favorite part of these weekly presentations because it gives me a chance to dig a little deeper into something that came up during the main episode. Now, to be fair, the most common criticism isn't difficult to understand. Many people have been told that DEI is essentially a zero-sum game. In this view, every opportunity that's given to a woman, a racial minority, a disabled person, or an LGBTQ employee must have been an opportunity taken away from a more qualified, straight white dude. The story goes something like this. DEI isn't about fairness at all. It's about replacing merit with identity and rewarding people for belonging to the right demographic category. Now, whether you've heard that argument from a politician, a podcaster, a co-worker, or an uncle who spends a little too much time watching Fox News, it's important to recognize that this understanding is what I would call a meme-level explanation. It's simple, it's emotionally satisfying to some people, and it's completely disconnected from what the philosophy of DEI was originally trying to accomplish. So, let's dive into that in this episode of Afterthoughts. All right, let's slow down and look at the words themselves first. The D stands for diversity. From a humanist perspective, diversity simply means recognizing the full range of human experiences. Different races, different cultures, religions, different abilities, backgrounds, perspectives, identities, just different life stories. Diversity starts with the observation that human beings are not interchangeable. We don't all see the world the same way, and that's not a bug in the system. It's a feature. Now, the E stands for equity. And this is probably the most misunderstood word in the entire acronym. Equity doesn't mean guaranteeing identical outcomes. It means recognizing that different people often face different barriers, and they may need different forms of support to reach the same starting line. If one person is wearing running shoes, shorts, and a tank top, while another is barefoot and carrying a backpack full of bricks, treating them equally doesn't make the race fair. Equity asks whether people have the tools they need to genuinely compete and succeed. But the key is that equity doesn't fix the race's ending. It fixes the starting line. And finally, the I stands for inclusion. Inclusion is what happens after diversity arrives. It's one thing to invite people into the room. It's another thing entirely to create an environment where they can contribute, participate, and thrive. Inclusion asks a simple question. Once people get here, do they actually feel like they belong here? Now, notice something important. None of these ideas require lowering standards. None of them require hostility toward white people or men or Christians or conservatives or any other group that sometimes feels threatened by DEI discussions. At its core, DEI is an attempt, Sometimes successful, sometimes very clumsy, but still an attempt to address a very human question. How do we build institutions that recognize the unique value and potential of every person? Now, that doesn't mean every DEI program is good. It doesn't mean every implementation has been wise. It certainly doesn't mean critics never have legitimate concerns. In fact, that's where we need to go next, because if we're going to have an honest conversation, we need to acknowledge that some of the criticism exists for a reason. So let's address the elephant in the room. One of the reasons conversations about DEI become so frustrating is that both sides are often talking past each other. Supporters sometimes act as though every criticism is motivated by prejudice or racism, while opponents sometimes act as though every DEI initiative is some sinister plot to undermine merit and attack white dudes. Reality, as usual, is messier than either one of those stories. The truth is that critics aren't always inventing their grievances out of thin air. Bad implementations of DEI absolutely exist. In fact, some of them deserve lots of criticism. Most of us have encountered examples of what I would call box-checking DEI. A company announces ambitious diversity goals, and suddenly managers feel pressured to focus more on demographic categories than on individual qualifications and potential. Whether this happens often or rarely, even the perception that someone was selected primarily because of their identity can undermine trust throughout an organization. If people begin to believe that merit no longer matters, the organization has just created a problem for itself. Now, then there are the performative public relations versions of DEI, and you've probably seen these. A company changes its logo for a month and adds a rainbow flag to it. They release a carefully worded statement about social justice. They post a few inspirational images on social media, and then the company goes right back to operating exactly as it always has. Nothing meaningful changes. The workplace culture remains the same. Opportunities remain the same. Leadership remains the same. It's diversity theater. It's not diversity work. And then we come to the training sessions. Now, I say this as someone who has spent a significant portion of my professional life designing and delivering training. Not all training is good training. Sometimes DEI workshops are thoughtful and engaging and genuinely educational. Other times, they feel like a mandatory trip to the principal's office. Participants leave feeling that they were being lectured to or shamed or stereotyped rather than informed and engaged. Instead of building empathy and understanding, the training creates resentment and defensiveness. That's not inclusion. That's an absolute failure of instructional design. But here's the important question. What should we conclude from these failures? Look, when I was in high school, I had a terrible math teacher. He was drunk most of the time, so his teaching was confusing, disorganized, and somehow made advanced math and trigonometry feel like a punishment for crimes I'd apparently committed in a previous life. Most of us have experienced a similar situation. And for me, it certainly didn't inspire me to want to be a math major in college, but I also didn't conclude that mathematics itself was worthless. I concluded that the teacher did a poor job of teaching math. The same principle applies here. A bad DEI program does not automatically invalidate the underlying ideas of diversity, equity, and inclusion. A poorly designed initiative is evidence that the initiative was poorly designed. A performative DEI corporate stunt is evidence that the corporation was being performative. An ineffective training session is evidence that someone created ineffective training. I think you can see the pattern here. The challenge is learning to distinguish between a flawed implementation and the underlying principle. Because if we fail to make that distinction, we end up throwing away valuable ideas simply because someone executed them badly. And that would be a mistake. And it's a mistake that's happening right now. The real question isn't whether bad DEI exists. Of course it does. The real question is whether the goals of fairness, opportunity, and inclusion are worth pursuing when they're done well. To answer that, we need to tackle what may be the biggest misconception in this entire debate: the belief that diversity and merit are somehow enemies. At the heart of the DEI debate is what I think is the most important misunderstanding of all. We've been encouraged to believe that we face a choice between diversity and merit. And the argument goes something like this: if you care about diversity, you're lowering standards. If you care about merit, you have to ignore diversity. Pick one. But that's a false dichotomy. It's a false choice. In fact, the entire argument depends on a hidden assumption that rarely gets examined. It assumes that our institutions were already operating as perfect meritocracies before DEI came along. It assumes that the most talented, qualified, and capable people were always naturally rising to the top, and that every opportunity was being distributed fairly based on merit alone. History suggests otherwise. My personal experience proves otherwise. And if you've worked in a large organization for any length of time, I know you've seen it too. Human beings are not particularly good at evaluating talent objectively. We like people who remind us of ourselves. We trust people with familiar backgrounds. We tend to favor people who attended the same schools or the same types of schools, or who belong to the same social circles, people who share our cultural assumptions or just make us feel more comfortable. None of this necessarily comes from malice. It's just part of being human. Think about how many jobs throughout history have been filled through family connections, personal networks, good old boy systems, legacy admissions to premier colleges, informal referrals, social access. Critics of DEI talk about merit as though it's always existed in this sort of pristine laboratory environment. In reality, merit has frequently been filtered through layers of privilege, familiarity, and hidden opportunities. That's why I think it's important to distinguish between talent and access. Talent appears to be distributed remarkably broadly across humanity. Intelligence, creativity, leadership ability, work ethic, resilience, artistic talent, innovative thinking, they all show up in every race, every neighborhood, every income level, every religion, and every culture. Human potential is one of the most evenly distributed resources on the planet. Human potential is. Opportunity is not. It is not evenly distributed. Two equally talented children can begin life with dramatically different circumstances. One may grow up in a well-funded school district with access to tutors and mentors, extracurricular activities, maybe even professional networks, while another may possess the same raw ability, but they encounter obstacles that make it much harder for that potential to develop. The difference isn't talent. The difference isn't potential. The difference is access to opportunity. This is where healthy DEI efforts can actually strengthen merit rather than weaken it. At its best, DEI functions like a filter that's designed to remove distortions from the system. The goal is not to replace merit. The goal of DEI is to uncover merit. A well-designed DEI program asks whether qualified candidates are being overlooked because of unconscious bias or outdated assumptions or inaccessible processes or cultural blind spots. It asks whether we're truly finding the best people or simply the most familiar people. Imagine a company searching for the best engineer, the best scientist, the best teacher, or the best leader. If their hiring process systematically overlooks certain pools of talent, they're not protecting merit. They're undermining it. They're leaving valuable human potential on the table. A healthy DEI framework tries to widen the search. It recognizes that excellence can emerge from unexpected places. DEI, a good DEI framework, challenges organizations to look beyond their usual networks and their usual assumptions so that the most capable people have a genuine opportunity to compete for opportunities. From that perspective, DEI and merit are not enemies. In fact, they're allies. Because if your goal is truly to identify the most qualified, most creative, most capable, and most uniquely talented people, then you should want systems that reduce bias rather than reinforce it. You should want processes that help reveal excellence wherever it exists. Healthy DEI doesn't ask us to hire unqualified people. It stops us from accidentally hiring familiar people over superior ones. And that's where the conversation becomes bigger than hiring practices or workplace policies. It becomes a question about what kind of society we want to build. Do we want a culture that leaves human potential undiscovered, or one that creates the conditions for as many people as possible to contribute their unique gifts? That's not just a workplace question. It's a human question. At this point, I'd like to zoom out a bit. Zoom out from the political arguments and the workplace policies and ask a bigger, broader question. What kind of country do we want to become? Because ultimately, the most important argument for diversity, equity, and inclusion isn't about checking demographic boxes or winning culture war debates. It's about whether we are creating the conditions for human beings to contribute their best ideas, their best work, and their full potential to our society. From a humanist perspective, the goal isn't to advantage one group over another. The goal is to build a society where as much human potential as possible has the opportunity to flourish. And there are cold, hard, practical reasons why this matters. One of the most consistent findings in organizational research is that diverse teams tend to perform better on complex problems than groups that are composed entirely of people with similar backgrounds and experiences. That doesn't mean every diverse team automatically succeeds. It doesn't mean that diversity is a magic solution to every challenge. What it does mean is that when people bring different perspectives to the table, they're a lot more likely to identify blind spots or to challenge assumptions, to generate creative solutions. Think about it this way. If everyone in a room has the same life experiences, they attended the same schools, they consume the same media, and approach problems in the same way, they're likely to make the same mistakes. homogeneous groups can become incredibly efficient at reinforcing their own assumptions. They become echo chambers. We've all seen this phenomenon play out in politics, religion, business, heck, even in families. The more insulated a group becomes, the more difficult it becomes to recognize its own blind spots. That's why healthy organizations actively seek out differing viewpoints. Not because disagreement is fun and pleasant, but because reality is complicated. America's biggest challenges certainly aren't getting any simpler. Whether we're talking about economic competitiveness, technological innovation, public health, climate resilience, accessibility, education, or national security, the problems facing future generations are going to require extraordinary creativity. Solving those problems means drawing upon the widest possible pool of talent, experience, and insight. It means making sure that brilliant ideas aren't overlooked because they happen to come from unexpected places. But there's also a deeper moral dimension to this conversation. Throughout this week's Mythologizing the Bible episode, throughout the main episode, we explore the value of uniqueness. The idea that every person brings something distinct and irreplaceable to the human story. If we genuinely believe that, then diversity becomes more than a workforce strategy. It becomes an expression of respect. A society that values uniqueness recognizes that human beings, they're not interchangeable parts. We're not interchangeable cogs in the machine. Every person sees the world through a slightly different lens. Every person carries experiences, perspectives, talents, and insights that nobody else possesses in exactly the same way. When we create environments that welcome those differences, we don't just benefit economically or organizationally. We affirm human dignity itself. That's why I sometimes think the most important question isn't whether DEI benefits marginalized groups. Of course it can. The more important question is whether we can afford to waste human potential. What happens when a talented student never gets the opportunity to develop their abilities? What happens when a brilliant employee leaves because they don't feel welcome? What happens when entire communities stop believing that their voices matter? What innovations never happen? What problems never get solved? What lives never reach their full potential? Those losses don't belong only to the individuals involved. Those losses belong to all of us. A flourishing society isn't one that asks people to become more alike. It's one that creates the conditions for people to contribute their unique strengths to a shared future. And from a humanist perspective, that's the strongest case for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Not because diversity is fashionable these days, not because inclusion is politically correct, but because human beings thrive when we make room for one another's humanity. As I wrap this up, I'd like to suggest that conversations about DEI require a little more intellectual maturity than our current political culture usually allows. The choice isn't between diversity and merit. It isn't between inclusion and excellence. And it certainly isn't a choice between helping some people and helping others. The real question is whether we're willing to build institutions that are capable of recognizing talent, removing unnecessary barriers, and drawing upon the full range of human potential that's available to us. At its best, DEI is not about tribalism. It's about moving beyond tribalism. It's about creating systems where people are evaluated more fairly, where different perspectives are welcome, and where merit, true merit, has a better chance of being recognized regardless of who someone is, what they look like, or where they come from. In that sense, diversity, equity, and inclusion are not alternatives to excellence. They're tools that can help us achieve it. So I'll leave you with a bit of a question. Look around your own life, your workplace, your volunteer organizations, your social circles, your neighborhood. Who is missing from the conversation? Whose perspective do you rarely hear? And what is one small thing you could do this week to make someone feel that their unique voice genuinely belongs? Because true inclusion doesn't begin with government policies or corporate initiatives. True inclusion begins with ordinary people making room for one another's humanity. Thanks for joining me for this episode of Afterthoughts. If you want to keep up on everything I'm doing, please head over to The Coda Project and subscribe to my newsletter. You'll get notifications whenever I publish anything, and I'll keep you updated on the weekly live streams of Mythologizing the Bible. If you subscribe for free over at the Coda Project, you'll start receiving my publication called The Weekly Compass. This is a brief guide on a single core value. Think of it as a mini lesson plan for personal growth. It's perfect for families, students, and adults because I include discussion questions designed for different age groups. As a subscriber, you'll also have access to the Guide to Kitchen Table Activism, which is the detailed resource that I designed to help you be politically active from your own home. The guide explains why activism is important, the philosophy behind kitchen table activism, and the foundational values it supports, before laying out how to use the tools you have to make your voice heard. The guide provides tools, tactics, and templates for you to use, and it only takes 15 minutes a week. If you care about our democracy, our country, and our world, then I encourage you to check it out. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, remember to question everything, keep what's good, and live what matters.